while back, I told you that Chapter 3, Proteus, may be the worst sand trap ever put into words. Now I have to tell you that by comparison with Chapter 14, Chapter 3 was a picnic on the beach. The Homeric title of Chapter 14 is Oxen of the Sun, and Joyce also called it a farraginous chronicle, playing on the Latin word farrago, which means mixed fodder for cattle. According to Richard Ellman, Joyce spent 1,000 hours writing the episode. And while working on it, he felt as if he himself were eating oxen. But he still managed to get through it in a little over 3 months, starting about the 1st of February 1920 and finishing by May 18, when he wrote to his friend Frank Budgeon, "The oxen of the bloody, bleeding sun are finished." Joyce's ordeal of creation, his literary labor pains on a chapter about childbearing, must of course be re-experienced by the reader. When this chapter came to Harriet Weaver, one of Joyce's most fervent admirers, it tested the outer limits of her devotion. "I think," she wrote, "this episode might also have been called Hades, for the reading of it is like being taken the rounds of hell." But my favorite of all comments on this episode was made some years ago by one of my own students. "The oxen of the sun," he wrote, "tramples the reader." Why am I telling you all this? Am I trying to scare you off? Not at all. I'm hoping that if you've gotten this far into Ulysses, nothing will make you quit now, and I'm even crazy enough to believe that the prospect of trouble ahead will merely buttress your determination to face it down. When a pregnant woman goes into labor, she doesn't quit. She can't quit. She just keeps on pushing until the baby comes. Well, gentlemen, if I can speak just to the men for a moment, this is a chapter about childbearing, and reading it may be as close as you'll ever get to feeling like a woman in labor. So ask yourself if you're man enough to undergo the labor of reading this chapter. If not, leave it to the women. Let's make things easy at first by starting with a sort of Lamaze exercise, reviewing the Homeric episode that stands behind this chapter. Ulysses' visit to Helios, the Greek god of the sun, comes near the end of his adventures. After making his way past Scylla and Charybdis and losing many men in the process, Ulysses and his surviving shipmates come to the island of Helios. Since Circe and the prophet Tiresias have both warned Ulysses that disaster will strike them if they go to this island, Ulysses wants to avoid it. But his men are near dead with exhaustion, so he grudgingly agrees to let them stop here on one condition. They must slaughter none of the sheep or oxen on this island and eat only the food they brought with them, the food that they got from Circe. Well, the men agree. But after a month of waiting for the right winds to blow, they run out of Circe's food and develop a ravenous hunger. So when Ulysses goes off to pray for divine help and the gods put him to sleep, Eurylochus goads the others to kill the best of the oxen and cook them. Then Ulysses wakes up to learn what they've done. He cries out in grief, and Helios calls down a curse on Ulysses' men. When they all set sail after 6 days of feasting, a storm strikes the ship and sinks everyone but Ulysses, who gets away by lashing the mast and the keel together and riding them to the island of Calypso. So much for the Homeric episode. Now, when you try to view Joyce's chapter 14 through the lens of this episode, the first question that comes to mind is this: what does the killing of the oxen in Homer's epic have to do with Joyce's chapter on childbearing? Joyce himself gives us the beginning of an answer. Ulysses' companions, he says, disobey the commands of Pallas, by which he means Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Joyce goes on, they slay and flay the oxen of the sun god, and are all drowned save the prudent and pious Ulysses. I interpret the killing of the sacred oxen as the crime against fecundity by sterilizing the act of coition. And I think my interpretation is as sound as that of any other commentator on Homer. Thus speaks Joyce himself. Hardly shy about voicing his opinions, Joyce confidently proclaims that the real theme of Homer's episode is a crime against fecundity. Whether or not Joyce is right about Homer does not matter here. What's important to us is that Joyce has given us a vital clue to his own chapter, which identifies cattle with fecundity and which brings back Stephen in a role both familiar and new. You remember that back in chapter 2, when he agreed to help Deasy publish his letter about hoof and mouth disease, Stephen imagined that Mulligan would call him a bullock-befriending bard. In this chapter, that epithet acquires a new twist. As a bullock-befriending bard, Stephen will not only defend the rights of cattle, but also the process of generating human life. For this process is threatened by all young men who seek only to copulate without inseminating, to block creation by means of contraception. So in some ways, this chapter replays the argument that Stephen makes in the library chapter, chapter 9. If the writer is to father or beget a whole race of people, as Shakespeare did, then he must treat with the greatest respect the physical process of gestation. And childbearing must be just as important in the story of this day as death and burial are. So let us now strengthen our grip on this theme by situating ourselves in space and time. It's now 10 p.m., and on top of everything else he's done, Bloom has one more thing to do. He's come to the National Maternity Hospital on Hollow Street in Dublin to ask about Mina Purefoy, who is now in her 3rd day of labor, an ordeal significantly worse than anything suffered by Bloom. While waiting for news of the delivery, Bloom sits with Stephen and a number of his boisterous friends as they drink and talk loudly and lewdly in what seems to be the intern's lounge or perhaps the visitor's waiting room. In any case, this is the first time that Stephen and Bloom are thrown together. And while they don't say a lot to each other, Bloom has plenty of time to observe Stephen and to think paternal thoughts about him. Bloom worries about Stephen. He fears that Stephen's wild and lecherous living will kill his own creative energy, will spill and waste the precious seed of his talent. And since Bloom has come to see Stephen as his surrogate son, as the replacement for poor little Rudy, the idea that Stephen might kill all of his creative potential is almost more than Bloom can bear. And now, Sir Leopold, that had of his body no man-child for an heir, looked upon him his friend's son, and was shut up in sorrow for his forepassed happiness. And as sad as he was, that him failed a son of such gentle courage, so grieved he also in no less measure for young Stephen, for that he lived riotously with those wastrels and murdered his goods with whores. Now, before talking further about Bloom's view of Stephen here, we have to consider the style of this passage, which will probably strike you as very peculiar. This isn't modern English, and it isn't the kind of English that we've generally found in the novel up to now. This passage is written in the style of English chronicles, dating from the late 16th century, the time of Queen Elizabeth I. Well, why on earth is Joyce using such a style to tell us what Bloom is thinking on the night of June 16, 1904? The simple answer is that Joyce aims to construct a running analogy between the development of the English language and the 9-month gestation of an infant. Working out this analogy is, of course, a wild project, but if anyone could even begin to bring it off, it would be Joyce. Richard Ellman, Joyce's biographer, tells us that during the writing of this chapter, Joyce kept before him a diagram showing the ontogeny of the fetus, and that he also studied George Saintsbury's History of English Prose Rhythm. Here he brings them together by marking the stages of fetal growth in a succession of prose styles ranging from Latinate English and Anglo-Saxon right up to the lucid elegance of writers like John Henry Newman and Walter Pater in the late 19th century. Joyce alludes at various points to the development of the fetus. Stuart Gilbert has tried to identify a number of these points. But frankly, I think anyone who tries to link the stages of gestation and the history of style throughout this chapter runs the same risk as those who try to show that the Sirens chapter can be analyzed just exactly like a fugue with all its technical features. Samuel Taylor Coleridge once famously said, no analogy walks on all four legs. And if we try to make it walk on all four legs, we're going to cripple it. Think about what's happening here in real time. Mina Purefoy is not going through 9 months of gestation. She is in her 3rd day of labor. And in the middle of the chapter, she actually gives birth, the main event of the chapter. So rather than straining to find references to every stage of gestation, or struggling to link Anglo-Saxon with the first month of pregnancy, Middle English with the second, and so on, let's try instead to see the big picture. Let's ask ourselves why Joyce launches himself into this stylistic tour de force, why he takes us through what Karen Lawrence has aptly called an odyssey of style. First of all, he shows us emphatically and dramatically that he aims to rival in this novel every other writer in the history of English prose. Typically, an apprentice writer learns his craft, as Joyce did, by deliberately imitating great writers, trying on their styles the way a boy might try on his father's coat. Joyce takes this process of imitation just about as far as it can go, because he takes no one writer as his model. Instead, like a virtuoso impersonator, he shows that he can mimic any great writer, any great English writer that he chooses. Furthermore, he can recreate their styles within a work of his own creation, making those styles serve his own design, his own great story of the gestation of the English language. Secondly, this odyssey of style allows Joyce to do on a grand scale what he has already done in part, to multiply the perspectives from which we see our Ulysses, Leopold Bloom. Just as no one identity can exhaust the complexity of Bloom's character, no one style or point of view can define him. We've just seen Bloom from 3 different perspectives, through the scornful eyes, or eye, of the rabidly anti-Semitic citizen, through the adoring eyes of the sentimental Gertie, and then through the self-appraising, more or less realistic eyes of Bloom himself. Because Gertie and the citizen view Bloom at about the same time as he views himself, we may call their perspectives synchronic, that is, simultaneous. But in chapter 14, the perspectives are diachronic, that is, temporally distinct, drawn from successive stages of English history and the English language, starting with Anglo-Saxon. Now, think about why Joyce makes this move. This whole novel is a gigantic exercise in metempsychosis, or reincarnation. If Bloom recalls and revives Ulysses, the hero of a poem almost 3,000 years old, Bloom can also revive any number of later wanderers, beginning with the speaker of an Anglo-Saxon poem called The Wanderer from roughly 1000 A.D. The Anglo-Saxon wanderer travels alone, far from his homeland and kinsmen in search of a new lord and hall. Bloom, too, is a lonely wanderer coming to a strange house, in this case a hospital, on an errand of mercy. And the Anglo-Saxon style brings out this archetypal significance. Some man that wayfaring was, stood by house door at night's oncoming. Of Israel's folk was that man that on earth wandering far had fared. Stark ruth of man his errand, that him lone led till that house. That is, stark mercy for humankind led him all alone to that house. Besides recalling the Anglo-Saxon wanderer, this man of Israel's folk also recalls a figure mentioned earlier by Mulligan in chapter 9, the figure of the wandering Jew. But unlike those 2 wanderers, Bloom is not just a victim of exile and denunciation. He's also a bearer of mercy and kindness. He's come to the hospital to see how Mina Purefoy is coping with her labor. As such, he also recalls a knight-errant of medieval romance, late medieval romance. So we are told, Sir Leopold heard on the upfloor cry on high, and he wondered what cry that it was, whether of child or woman. And I marvel, said he, that it be come or now. Meseems it dureth overlong. woman's woe he sat with wonder pondering. This is late medieval English, but who can say that modern English could express any better, any more poignantly and powerfully, the depth of Bloom's sympathy for a woman in labor, a woman in pain? Here is a chapter, in other words, that once again reveals to us the timelessness of Bloom. Bloom, who wanders through Dublin as Ulysses, as a lonely Anglo-Saxon, as a medieval knight-errant, as Shakespeare. What is the age of the soul of man? Asks the chapter later on. The soul of Bloom is ageless in its wandering, in its caring, and above all in its paternal solicitude for young Stephen Dedalus. So let's return to Stephen, who has already had quite a lot to drink, but is nonetheless holding his own in an argument with his boisterous friends. When the conversation turns to Deasy's letter about hoof and mouth disease, Lenehan says he cares nothing for sick Irish cattle, and a blowhard named Frank Costello says, "Mort aux vaches, death to the cows." This alarms Bloom, who can't bear to think that all Irish cows will be slaughtered, and also rouses Stephen. When Costello says, in effect, that cows cannot be cured, Stephen tells them of the cure described in Deasy's letter, thus forging a link between himself and Bloom as bullock befrienders, friends of cattle. To be bullock befriending in this chapter is to support life, fertility, procreation, the whole process of gestation. In their own way, Stephen and Bloom each defend procreation against all the licentious young men who seek only to drink and copulate without begetting anything or anyone. In the middle of the chapter, Nurse Callan enters the lounge full of drunken revelers in order to speak a few words quietly to a young doctor named Dixon and then leave. When her brief appearance prompts the drunken Costello to call her a monstrous fine bit of cowflesh and make other lewd cracks, Dixon announces that Mina Purefoy has at last produced her baby, a bouncing boy, and he rebukes Costello for disrespecting both the nurse and the childbearing woman. Now we hear from Bloom. Full of sympathy for a woman in labor and delighted to learn that she has at last given birth, Bloom is revolted by Costello's cracks and says so to the man sitting next to him. Happy to hear that Mina Purefoy has at last been rewarded for her childbearing pains, Bloom is vexed that anyone else should take the news coldly, unfeelingly, heartlessly. His reverence for newborn life reminds us of what he felt even in the burial chapter, and also recalls what Stephen said earlier in this one. For Stephen stands with Bloom in this chapter as a defender of life. Even though Bloom fears that Stephen is wasting himself with booze and whores, and even though Stephen's own friends charge him with deflowering maidens, he plainly attacks the use of contraceptives or any other interference with the genesis of life. What, he asks, what are those God-possible souls that we nightly impossibilize, which is the sin against the Holy Ghost, Lord and giver of life? For, sirs, he says, our lust is brief. We are the means to those small creatures within us, and nature has other ends than we. Now, does this mean that Stephen is a right-to-lifer, and that if he were alive today, he would deny a woman's right to choose? Well, it could mean this, but Stephen has other ends, or larger ends, than simply banning contraceptives, as the Roman Catholic Church does even now, or fighting abortion, which he doesn't mention at all. Stephen is an apostle of creation in all senses. For Stephen, as we have already seen, biological fatherhood becomes a metaphor for the process by which an artist, such as Shakespeare, begets a race of characters. Stephen champions the begetting of life in this chapter because for him it symbolizes a fundamentally literary act, something an artist generates in words. In woman's womb, he says, word is made flesh. But in the spirit of the Maker, all flesh that passes becomes the word that shall not pass away. This is the post-creation. In spite of his eloquence, Stephen makes no headway against the voices of lust in this raucous company. But the lusty young men are sharply admonished when a clap of thunder strikes outside, a black crack of noise in the street. Back in chapter 2, Stephen said that God was a noise in the street. The thunderstorm outside right now might be the voice of God striking these licentious revelers, just as the storm struck Ulysses and his men after they had recklessly slaughtered the cattle of Helios. In the language of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a 17th century allegory filled with characters named for various virtues and vices, the narrator says that Mr. Bloom, Mr. Cautious Calmer, tries to calm the fears of Costello, now called Boastard. That Bloom tries to calm him by explaining the thunder as a natural phenomenon. Unpersuaded, Boastard tries to drink away his desperation, while his fellows boldly claim that they will go on chasing whores and using condoms to shield them against syphilis and offspring. "Wherein, O wretched company," writes the Bunyan-esque narrator, "were ye all deceived? For that was the voice of God that was in a very grievous rage, that he would presently lift his arm and spill their souls for their abuses and their spillings, done by them contrariwise to his word, which forth to bring brenningly biddeth." This Bunyan-esque God resembles Homer's Helios, who destroys Ulysses' shipmates for slaughtering the oxen of the sun. But in this case, the rain sent by the thunderstorm fertilizes a barren land and thus prefigures the moment of regeneration that comes soon after when Mina's baby is born at last. Even if the thunderstorm were destructive, Stephen and Bloom stand together for life in the process of gestation, so they might seem worthy of being spared, just as Ulysses survives the storm that drowns his shipmates. But as usual, Joyce complicates things for us. For neither Bloom nor Stephen is a perfect spokesman for life and the creative process. Right after Bloom complains of Costello's impudent response to the birth of Mina's baby, the narrator assumes the voice of an 18th century satirist to ask how this alien, namely Bloom, has constituted himself the lord paramount of our internal polity, taking deadly aim at Bloom's implicit claim to be the prophet of procreation. The satirist reminds us of Bloom's masturbation and his failure to plow his own home field. "It ill becomes him," writes the narrator, "to preach the gospel of procreation. Has he not nearer home a seed field that lies fallow for want of the plowshare? A habit reprehensible at puberty is second nature and an opprobrium in middle life. If he must dispense the balm of Gilead in nostrums and apothegms of dubious taste to restore to health a generation of unfledged profligates, let his practice consist better with the doctrines that now engross him. Let him practice what he preaches." Once again, Bloom takes his lumps from the narrator, and this time we cannot simply rush to his defense as the victim of a benighted tormentor. He has masturbated. He has not had sex with Molly for more than 10 years. And these two facts complicate his role as the quintessential father. Stephen is likewise vulnerable. While speaking as the champion of creation, both biological and literary, Stephen shows his friends some money. In the style of late 16th century English chronicles, he shows them glistering coins of the tribute, and Goldsmith notes the worth of £2 19 shilling that he had, he said, for a song which he writ. "Look at the money I'm making with my poetry," says Stephen. But we know better. We know that Stephen pocketed £3 12 shillings this morning as his monthly pay for teaching, not writing, but teaching at the Dalkey School. If he's now down to £2 19 shillings, he's managed in barely half a day to drop 13 shillings, almost $80, mostly on booze. So in spite of what Stephen says, Bloom has good reason to worry that Stephen is squandering his goods. And not only is he spending all the money he has, this champion of creation has not yet generated any literary offspring worthy of the name. When a character named Lynch speaks to him of their old grade school classmates, Stephen says grandly that they are phantoms of the past, and that he, bullock-befriending bard, is lord and giver of their life. When he then crowns himself with vine leaves to signify his status as a poet, Lynch says, that answer and those leaves will adorn you more fitly when something more and greatly more than a capful of light odes can call your genius Father. Touché. In effect, Lynch asks Stephen the same question that the narrator implicitly asks of Bloom. What sort of father are you? What have you produced? What are you actually generating? Shifting back and forth between literary and biological genesis, between familial and artistic fatherhood, this question goes straight to the heart of both Stephen and Bloom. Yet the question of paternity gets still more complicated near the end of the chapter, when the narrator mockingly celebrates the would-be hero of this chapter, the father of Mina's baby. To salute the father, the narrator uses the style of Thomas Carlyle, a 19th century English essayist and historian whose prose sometimes hammered like a steam engine. "By heaven," writes the narrator, "by heaven, Theodore Purefoy, thou hast done a doughty deed and no botch. Thou art, I vow, the remarkablest progenitor, barring none in this chaffering, all-including, most farraginous chronicle. Astounding! In her lay a God-framed, God-given, preformed possibility which thou hast fructified with thy modicum of man's work. Cleave to her, serve, toil on, labor like a very bandog, and let Scolament and all Malthusiasts go hang. Thou art all their daddies, Theodore." We're told that Joyce often used to chuckle as he wrote, and that he sometimes laughed out loud. I suspect he shook with laughter as he wrote this mock tribute to a second accountant of the Ulster Bank who had done his modicum of man's work in the bedroom and thereby sired his 9th child. Joyce is laughing here, laughing right up his sleeve. In pretending that Theodore Purefoy is more remarkable than himself, the author of this novel, the father of this chaffering, all-including, most farraginous chronicle, Joyce is once again taking comic aim at the concept of fatherhood as a model for literary creation. Does the man's little spasm of excitement really show the literary artist what he must do to produce a major work of literature? Or should he rather look to the long, hard work done by the woman, to the months of gestation and nurturing, to the final ordeal of delivery? Joyce took 7 years to generate Ulysses, and he modeled this very chapter on the stages of gestation. He's telling us, I think, that motherhood symbolizes literary creation far more powerfully than fatherhood does or can. Joyce sustains the analogy between literary and biological gestation right up to the end of the chapter, where he springs a final surprise. Newborn babies are always messy, noisy, and shocking. And so it is with the history of language, which is a history of progress and refinement, but also of regeneration, rebirth, renewal, in a word, surprise. This chapter takes us stylistically forward, it seems, from the primitive, alliterative beat of Anglo-Saxon to the elegant rhythms of late Victorian prose, the resonance of writers such as John Henry Newman, Walter Pater, and John Ruskin. But what does this long process of gestation finally beget at the end of the chapter? A drunken babble of tongues, the stylistic equivalent of a screaming newborn child. The final paragraphs are no longer prose, no longer a coherent sequence of complete sentences. In Joyce's own words, they are a frightful jumble of pidgin English, Cockney Irish, Bowery slang, and broken doggerel, all mixed up with drunken rant and even sounds of vomit coming possibly from our friend Stephen. Blap, blap. Stephen and his pals have left the hospital and are now headed to a pub called Burke's, as if they weren't already drunk enough. As they hit the street talk itself erupts like a volcano, bursting through all the sedimented layers of English style, blowing them sky high. Language itself is reborn, and Joyce's novel once again bears witness to its birth, the rebirth of living speech. No matter how raw and vulgar and outrageous and irreverent, the language is incontestably alive. Listen then to the words at the very end, the words of the would-be Elijah, whose voice is conjured up out of a poster spotted by one of the revelers. The poster announcing his coming is made to speak so that he seems to be preaching right now on the street to Dublin's vomiting young drunks in the middle of the night. Alexander J. Christ Dowie, that's my name. That's yanked to glory most half this planet from Frisco Beach to Vladivostok. The deity ain't no nickel-dime bum show. You'll need to rise precious early, you sinner there, if you want to diddle the almighty God. Blah! Not half. He's got a cough mixture with a punch in it for you, my friend, in his back pocket. Just you try it on.